Okay, so just a short video on the steps for hypothesis testing. So always step 1, we set up the null hypothesis and we call that H0. Then we have an alternative hypothesis, H1. Step 3, we carry out our calculations, and then our last step, we will comment on the calculations and give a conclusion. And that conclusion is one of two. We either fail to reject the null hypothesis or we reject the null hypothesis, and that just depends on the results that we get in step 3. So if we're given a question, say, where they say the mean result of students is maybe 64. So for us, we would say our null hypothesis, and you keep it as simple as possible. The mean is 64. Then my alternative hypothesis is simply that the mean is not equal to 64. So it's always that scenario. The mean will be equal to x, or else the mean is not equal to x, whatever x is. Okay, so that's kind of a summary for your first step. Okay, so our calculations will depend on the context of the question. So for step 1 and 2, and then for step 3, okay, so if we have a population proportion, then our approach there will be a 95% confidence interval. And you'll know already from the previous videos that our formula for that will be p hat plus or minus 1.96 times the root of p times 1 minus p all over n. Okay, and then if we are given a mean, we have two approaches. Our first choice is a test statistic. And that'll be x. Z is equal to, it's in your log tables, no need to memorize. And then your second option is going to be your 95%. Interval, and for that, our formula then, which we've covered in previous videos, is going to be your x bar plus or minus 1.96 times sigma over root n. Okay, and then your last step in your, so you'll carry out those workings, and your last step is to form a conclusion. So for our 95% confidence interval, if it lies within the range, then we fail to reject. If it lies outside the range, then our wording is that we reject the null hypothesis, and you bring your workings into your conclusion here. And if we've worked with a test statistic, so what happens here then is, if it is in the critical region, and if you need a recap on test statistic or either of the confidence intervals, just have a look back at the videos on them. So if it's in the critical region, then we reject the null hypothesis. And again, comment on your workings. But if it's not in the critical region, then we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, so that's our steps for hypothesis testing. Same set of steps every time. just as to which calculation we carry out depends on the information given. Now, if the question mentions test statistic, you have to take that approach. And then on the other hand, if they mention 95% confidence interval, you have to take that approach for the mean. But if they don't specify, our first choice will be test statistic, and then the backup option will be 95% confidence interval. Okay, so that's a summary of your steps for a hypothesis test.